Cowboy found Apache lost in the blizzard and the stranger returning with Snowmelt Rewrote Destiny. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main character. The snow fell heavily on the land, turning the world into a blanket of white. Jack Thornton had been working for hours, chopping wood at the edge of his property, when the wind picked up, howling through the trees like an animal on the prowl. He didn't mind the cold. He had spent most of his life in this harsh climate, living alone in the isolated hills of the American frontier. He had made his peace with solitude, finding comfort in the rhythm of his axe against the wood, the creak of his cabin's floorboards, and the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. But this snowstorm was different. It wasn't just the snow, or the howling wind, or the bitter cold. It was the feeling of something strange in the air, a tension that even the wildest of blizzards couldn't shake. That's when he heard it, a soft cry, distant but clear, carried by the wind. His first instinct was to ignore it, but something stopped him. He wiped the snow from his brow and scanned the horizon. There, through the blizzard, he saw a figure, a small shape moving slowly through the whiteout. His heart skipped a beat. In the distance, a lone figure trudged through the snow, struggling against the wind, their form almost swallowed by the storm. Jack squinted, trying to make out any details, but all he could see was a silhouette, a small body bent low against the force of the snow. Without thinking, Jack grabbed his coat and rifle, heading toward the figure. As he drew closer, he could make out the details more clearly. A woman, barely standing, her clothes torn and her skin pale with frostbite. She was Apache. Jack had seen enough to recognize the familiar features of the native peoples in these parts. She stumbled, nearly falling into the snow, but managed to catch herself just in time. Her face was as cold as the storm around her, but there was a desperation in her eyes. He moved quickly, reaching her side before she could fall again. "You're safe now," Jack said softly, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. He draped his coat over her shoulders, trying to warm her with what little body heat he had left. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but also with something else, recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice strained and weak. She didn't say more, but the gratitude in her eyes was enough. Jack didn't know her story, but he didn't need to. He had seen enough suffering in his own life to know what it meant to help someone in need. He helped her to her feet, guiding her back toward the cabin. As they moved through the snow, Jack felt a strange weight in the air, a sense that something was about to change. When they reached the warmth of the cabin, Jack laid the woman down by the fire, carefully tending to her wounds. Her eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion taking over. The next morning, when Jack awoke, the snowstorm had passed. The sky was clear, but the air was still bitter with cold. He went outside, feeling the stillness in the air, when he noticed something strange. There, in the distance, were riders, more than a dozen, their figures dark against the white snow. They were Apache, and they were coming for the woman. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized who they were. The woman he had helped was not just anyone, she was someone of great importance. She wasn't just a lost traveler, she was a leader, and she was returning with Snowmelt, the gift of life, to rewrite the destiny of her people. Jack had unknowingly become part of a story much larger than himself, and the events that were unfolding before him would change his life forever. The riders approached, their dark figures cutting through the snow like shadows. Jack stood at the doorway of his cabin, watching them slowly draw nearer. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air. The woman, still resting by the fire, had not stirred since the night before. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive, and now that was enough. Jack knew who these riders were, they were Apache, and they had come for her. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease in his chest. He had saved her life, but what would this tribe think of him now? Would they see him as a friend, or would he be just another outsider, a white man trespassing in their land? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He turned quickly, his heart racing as the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, his face stern but his eyes soft with gratitude. He wore traditional Apache clothing, his face painted with the intricate designs of his people. "You have helped our sister," the man said, his voice deep and respectful. Jack nodded, stepping aside to let the man in. He motioned toward the woman by the fire. "She is safe," Jack said simply. The man looked at her for a moment, his gaze softening as he approached her side. He knelt down, whispering something in her ear in a language Jack didn't understand. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw the man, a faint smile crossed her lips. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded. "We have come to honor you." He stood and turned to Jack, his expression shifting to one of respect. "And to honor you," he added. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. The man's words weren't a threat, but a recognition of what he had done. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play here. The woman was important, and now, it seemed, Jack had become a part of her story. "I did what anyone would have done," Jack said, feeling awkward under the man's gaze. "It was the right thing to do." The Apache man smiled, his face warm despite the cold. "Not everyone would have done it. Not everyone has the heart to act in the face of danger. You saved her life, and now we return the favor." Jack was about to ask what he meant by that when the sound of hooves interrupted him. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The riders were getting closer, and their numbers seemed to grow with each passing second. There were more than a dozen now, moving with purpose, their horses galloping through the snow with the kind of discipline Jack had seen in only the most experienced riders. The man by the fire stood up, his face turning serious. "They are here to repay your kindness," he said. "We will protect you, as you have protected her." Jack's heart raced. He had no idea what to expect now. He had saved one life, but was he prepared for the consequences of that action? The Apache man motioned toward the riders, who had now arrived at the edge of the clearing. They dismounted in unison, their movements fluid and coordinated. Jack watched as they formed a loose circle around the cabin, their eyes focused and alert. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack could feel the weight of the moment. The riders were here for something, but what? The man who had spoken to Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You have done something great," he said, his gaze shifting to Jack. "You have saved one of our own. Now we honor you as a friend, as a brother." Jack nodded, trying to make sense of it all. He had never expected this. He had never thought his simple act of kindness would lead to anything so grand. But now, it seemed, the world was changing before his eyes. The riders remained still, waiting for the signal. Jack wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that whatever it was, it would change the course of his life forever. The riders stood in a tight formation, their eyes unwavering as they scanned the surroundings. The man who had spoken to Jack earlier stepped forward once more, his gaze now steady with a quiet authority. Jack felt the weight of the moment settle around him, the stillness in the air almost tangible. It was as if the very land itself was holding its breath. "This is a time of great change," the Apache man said, his voice low but clear. "The land has shifted, and so have we. You have shown kindness when others would have turned away. Now we honor that." Jack didn't know what to say. He had never expected anything like this, never thought a simple act of compassion would lead to such a moment. The woman, still resting by the fire, opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft glow of the morning sun. Her face was pale, but there was a spark of life in her eyes. "You saved me," she said, her voice raspy, yet filled with an undeniable strength. Jack gave a small nod. "It was nothing," he replied. "Anyone would have done the same." But the woman only smiled weakly. "Not everyone would have." She pushed herself up from the floor, taking a few unsteady steps toward the gathering of riders. Jack felt a pang of uncertainty deep in his chest. He had saved her, yes, but what did it mean now? What was going to happen next? The Apache man, who had been observing the exchange, turned his attention back to Jack. "She is more than just a woman lost in the snow," he said, his tone carrying an unspoken weight. "She is a leader, a symbol of our people's strength. And because of your actions, you have become a part of that strength." Jack's mind raced. He had no idea what the man meant, but the gravity of his words was clear. The riders around them were not just a group of warriors. They were part of something much larger, something Jack had unknowingly become involved in. The woman, standing now with the support of one of the riders, gave Jack a long look. "I will not forget this," she said quietly. "Your kindness will not go unrecognized." With that, she turned toward the group of riders, her movements slow but purposeful. The riders followed her, their heads held high, each step synchronized with the next. Jack watched in silence, his heart still heavy with confusion and wonder. What had just happened? The man who had spoken earlier approached Jack again, his face softening. "You have done more than you realize," he said. "You have helped to change the fate of many, not just this one." Jack opened his mouth to respond but found no words. He could only nod, unsure of what he was supposed to feel. As the riders began to move off into the distance, the woman turned back one last time, her eyes meeting Jack's. She gave him a small, silent nod, as if to acknowledge something deeper between them. Then, with the wind at their backs, the Apache riders disappeared into the snow, leaving Jack alone once more. But he knew he was no longer truly alone. His life, once quiet and simple, had changed forever. What had started as an act of kindness in the midst of a blizzard had now become something much more profound, a turning point, a moment that would shape the rest of his days. Jack stood there for a long time, watching the trail of riders fade into the distance, the wind carrying the sound of their departure like a whisper on the edge of the world. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget the woman he had saved, and the warriors who had come to honor him. This was only the beginning of a story that would span lifetimes, a story that had already rewritten the destiny of both the Apache people and the man who had once been nothing more than a solitary cowboy. As the last of the riders disappeared, Jack turned back toward his cabin. The snow still lay heavy on the ground, but the air felt different now, as if the storm had passed, leaving something new in its wake. Days passed, and the world outside Jack Thornton's cabin remained blanketed in snow. The once oppressive quiet had given way to a strange, unspoken feeling, one of anticipation, as though something monumental was about to unfold. Jack couldn't shake the image of the Apache woman, her dark eyes filled with a gratitude that seemed far deeper than mere thanks. He kept replaying the moment when the riders had left, their figures disappearing into the endless white, leaving him with more questions than answers. What had he truly become a part of? What was the meaning behind the riders' reverence? He had done nothing extraordinary in his eyes. He had merely helped someone in need. And yet, it seemed as if that simple act had set something into motion that could not be undone. Jack stood by the fire one evening, stirring the coals as he thought about the events that had led him here. His cabin felt emptier now, despite the warmth of the flames. The quiet had never felt so loud. The solitude he had once cherished now seemed like a distant memory. But there was no going back. His life had changed. The knock at the door came unexpectedly. Jack stood still for a moment, unsure whether he had heard it right. Another knock this time. Louder, more urgent. He quickly moved to the door, his heart racing in his chest. When he opened it, standing there was the same Apache man who had spoken to him before. His presence seemed to fill the doorway, his eyes piercing through the cold air. "You must come with us," the man said, his voice steady, as if it were the only thing Jack could understand in that moment. Jack blinked in confusion. "Come with you? To where?" The man's gaze softened slightly. "To the tribe. It is time to honor the debt that has been paid." Jack felt a strange tension rise in his chest. "I thought I thought I had already helped. I don't know what more there is. The Apache man nodded slowly. You helped more than you know. But the time has come for you to understand your place in this story. Jack didn't fully understand, but something about the man's words made him feel as if he had no choice but to follow. And so, Jack grabbed his coat and rifle, stepping out into the cold once more. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was thick with the weight of something unspoken. They walked in silence, Jack's boots crunching in the snow as they made their way through the wilderness. The landscape, once so familiar to Jack, now felt foreign and expansive, like a world he had never truly known. They walked for miles, the silence only broken by the wind and the occasional call of a distant animal. As they neared a clearing, Jack saw something that made his breath catch. A group of riders, more than he had ever seen before, stood waiting. Their faces were solemn, their postures proud, as they watched him approach. The Apache man who had led Jack stepped forward, his voice quiet but filled with authority. This is your destiny, he said. These are the people you have helped. The debt is paid, but the future is yours to shape. Jack felt a sudden rush of realization. This wasn't just about a single act of kindness. This was about something much greater, a bond forged in the heat of a moment that had now transcended into something larger, something beyond what he could ever have imagined. The riders slowly began to move, surrounding Jack with a sense of ceremony, as if guiding him into something profound. Something that had been set in motion long before he had ever stepped into the blizzard to help a stranger. He stood at the center of it all, his heart racing, his mind spinning with questions. The Apache man who had first approached him stepped up beside Jack, his gaze firm. You will be a part of our people now, he said. Not as an outsider, but as a brother. Jack's world shifted in that moment. He had thought he was just a cowboy, a man who kept to himself, who helped when he could. But now, it seemed, he was no longer just a man of the land. He was part of a much larger story, one that spanned generations and connected cultures in ways he had never imagined. The wind howled again, but this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt alive, as if the land itself was welcoming him, pulling him into something new, something profound. As the riders began to move, Jack realized that the life he had known was behind him now. The future was ahead, and it was waiting for him, just as it had always been. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing: he was no longer alone. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered land. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking slightly into the soft snow, watching the Apache riders prepare for the evening. They were moving with purpose, their faces focused, and their movements coordinated. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was no longer just a cowboy, alone in his cabin on the outskirts of the world. He had crossed the threshold, and now he was part of something much larger than himself. As the riders gathered around the fire, Jack was invited to join them. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of his place among them, but then the same Apache man who had led him here gave him a reassuring nod. You are one of us now, the man said, his voice calm but filled with a deep respect. Jack nodded slowly and made his way to the fire, taking a seat on a log across from the Apache man. The warmth of the flames felt good against his cold skin, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and the crackling of the fire. Around him, the Apache riders sat in silence, their eyes reflecting the firelight, their expressions unreadable. Jack wasn't sure what to say, but the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like a space where words weren't needed. After a while, the Apache man spoke again. We have waited for this moment for a long time, he said, his gaze steady. You have brought honor to your people, and now you have earned the right to stand with us. Jack felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had never thought of himself as someone who could bring honor to anyone. He had always kept to himself, preferring the solitude of his land to the company of others. But now, in this moment, he realized that his actions had meant something more than he had understood. He wasn't just a man on the fringes of society anymore. He had become part of a larger story, A story that had been unfolding for generations. The night stretched on, and as the fire burned low, the Apache man shared the story of his people, their struggles, their resilience, and their connection to the land. Jack listened in silence, the weight of their history settling over him. It was a history of survival, of battles fought and lost, of moments of triumph and moments of deep sorrow. And yet, despite everything, they had endured. "The land chooses who belongs to it," the Apache man said, his voice soft but firm. "And it has chosen you, Jack Thornton." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He had never thought of himself as someone who was chosen for anything. He had simply lived his life the way he thought best. But now, as he sat around the fire with these people, he understood that there was something greater at work. He had been drawn into their story for a reason. And it wasn't just because of a single act of kindness in the midst of a snowstorm. It was because he had a part to play in the future of the Apache people. As the night grew colder and the fire dwindled to embers, the Apache riders began to move off to their sleeping places. Jack stood slowly, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones. The Apache man who had spoken to him earlier approached once again. "Rest now," he said, his voice gentle. "Tomorrow, we ride together." Jack nodded, unsure of what the next day would bring, but certain of one thing: his life had changed forever. He had stepped into a world he had never known, and now, there was no turning back. As he lay down under the stars, the wind howling softly in the distance, Jack realized that the future was uncertain, but it was his now. The choices he made would shape not only his own destiny but the destiny of those around him. And he was ready to face whatever came next. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that only a fresh snowfall could bring. Jack woke up early, as he always did, his body accustomed to the quiet and the cold. He stepped outside, the crisp air biting at his skin, the snow beneath his boots crunching with every step. The world around him was silent, except for the distant sound of horses and the occasional call of a bird. The Apache riders were already awake, preparing their horses for the day's journey. They moved with a sense of purpose, their faces hard with determination, yet there was an undercurrent of respect for what had come before. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them, still unsure of where his place was among them. The Apache man, who had spoken to him many times before, approached him. "Today you ride with us," the man said, his tone serious, but not unkind. Jack nodded, feeling a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. He had ridden horses his entire life, but this felt different. This wasn't just a ride through the plains. This was a ride with purpose, a ride that would shape his future. He moved toward the horses, the cold air stinging his lungs with every breath. As he mounted his horse, Jack realized something. This wasn't just a journey for survival. This was a journey for understanding. He wasn't just riding with the Apache to honor their traditions. He was riding to become a part of their story, to share in the bond that tied them to this land. The riders gathered together, their horses lined up, and Jack found himself at the center of the group. The Apache man, who had spoken to him before, nodded to him, acknowledging his presence. "We ride to the mountains," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "There, we will meet with the elders. They will decide what comes next for you." Jack's heart raced as they began to move, the rhythmic sound of hooves against the snow creating a steady beat in his mind. They rode for hours, the landscape unfolding before them in waves of white and green. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks hidden behind a veil of mist. As they neared the base of the mountains, the air grew thicker, colder. The ground beneath them began to change, the snow giving way to rocky terrain. Jack could feel the tension in the group. This was no ordinary ride. This was a journey to something unknown. They arrived at a small village nestled at the foot of the mountains, its inhabitants moving quietly through the streets, their faces solemn. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as they entered the village. The Apache had lived here for generations, their people bound to the land by something deeper than tradition. As they dismounted, the villagers watched them closely, their eyes full of curiosity and respect. The Apache man who had led Jack gestured for him to follow. "The elders are waiting," he said. Jack followed him into a large tent at the center of the village, where the air was thick with the smell of herbs and fire. The elders sat in a circle, their faces lined with age, their eyes sharp with wisdom. Jack felt a rush of nervous energy as he entered the tent, unsure of what to expect. The Apache man who had guided him stepped forward, speaking in the language of the tribe. The elders listened intently, their faces expressionless, until one of them finally spoke. "You have earned the right to stand with us," the elder said, his voice deep and commanding. "But now you must prove yourself." Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Prove himself? How could he prove himself to these people? He had only helped one woman in a blizzard. What did that have to do with anything? The elder's gaze shifted to Jack, his eyes piercing. "Your heart is pure, but you must understand our ways," he continued. "You must know the land as we do. You must know what it means to be one of us." Jack nodded, unsure of what was being asked of him. The elder stood, his movements slow but purposeful. "You will live among us for a time," the elder said. "You will learn our ways, and in time, you will earn your place." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for. He had been brought here not just to witness the Apache way of life, but to become a part of it. The journey he had started on had only just begun. As the elder finished speaking, Jack felt a deep sense of determination settle over him. He had a purpose now. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He was a part of something much larger, something that spanned generations and had a history far beyond his understanding. And he was ready to begin that journey, to prove that he was worthy of the place he had been given. The elders nodded to one another, their approval clear in their eyes. The Apache man who had been his guide stepped forward once more. "We welcome you," he said simply, his voice filled with respect. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was where he was meant to be. Jack stood at the edge of the village, the weight of the elder's words still echoing in his mind. He had been told that he must prove himself, that he had earned the right to stand with the Apache people, but now it felt like a challenge. He had always thought of himself as just a man who lived in the wilderness, a simple cowboy. But now, standing among these people who had lived in harmony with the land for generations, Jack felt small, as though his life up to that point had been insignificant. He followed the Apache man who had led him here, walking through the village as the morning sun warmed the snow-covered ground. The village was peaceful, quiet, a place of simplicity and deep connection to nature. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and earth, and the people moved with a grace that spoke of a life lived with purpose. They passed a group of children playing by the river, their laughter light and carefree. Jack couldn't help but smile as he watched them, reminded of his own childhood, far from this place. They reached the edge of the village, where a small group of Apache warriors were gathered around a fire, preparing for the day's journey. Jack was still uncertain of what lay ahead, but the seriousness in their eyes made it clear that this was no ordinary journey. The Apache man who had been his guide gestured for Jack to approach. "Today you begin your lessons," he said, his voice steady. "You will learn what it means to be a part of our people." Jack nodded, feeling both excited and apprehensive. He had no idea what these lessons would entail, but he was ready. The first lesson was simple: understanding the land. The Apache man took Jack on a walk through the forest, teaching him about the trees, the animals, and the rhythms of the earth. They stopped at a large oak tree, its bark rough under Jack's hand. "This tree has stood here for many years," the Apache man explained. "It is a symbol of strength and resilience. The land gives us what we need, but we must also respect it." Jack listened carefully, absorbing the wisdom that seemed to flow effortlessly from the Apache man. As they continued their walk, Jack realized that every step, every movement, was part of something larger, something that had been passed down through generations. He had spent his life isolated from others, but now he felt connected to something greater than himself. They reached a small clearing where a group of women were gathering herbs. Jack watched in silence as the women worked, their hands moving with precision and care. The Apache man spoke again. "The women of our tribe are the heart of our people," he said. "They are the healers, the nurturers, the ones who keep the balance." Jack nodded, understanding the importance of what the man was saying. He had always known that the land was important, but now he understood that it was the people who made it meaningful. After a while, the Apache man led Jack back to the village. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. He had come here to learn, but what he was discovering was more than he had ever imagined. The evening air was cool, and the fire in the center of the village flickered brightly. As Jack sat down with the others, the Apache man turned to him. "Tomorrow, we will begin your training in the ways of our people," he said. "But today you have taken the first step." Jack smiled, feeling a sense of pride that he had never felt before. He had been accepted, not just as an outsider, but as a part of something much larger. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jack leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire wash over him. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to face whatever came next. The morning light broke through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground as Jack awoke to the sound of the village stirring around him. The Apache people were already up, preparing for the day's activities. Jack stood, stretching his legs, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. He had been living with the tribe for several weeks now, learning their ways, gaining their trust, and in return, they had shared their wisdom with him. Today was different though. Today, he would begin his training in earnest. The Apache man who had been his guide approached, his face serious but not unkind. "Today, we test your strength," he said, his voice steady. Jack nodded, a mixture of excitement and nerves rising in his chest. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his hands instinctively gripping the reins of his horse. The Apache man motioned toward the horizon, where a narrow mountain path wound through the rocks. "Follow that path," he said. "It is a journey of endurance, and it will test your body, your mind, and your spirit." Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never been one for long, grueling tests, but this was different. This was a challenge to prove himself, to truly belong to the Apache people. Without another word, the Apache man mounted his horse and began to ride, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as they made their way toward the path. Jack followed, his own horse trotting steadily behind. The journey took them through dense forests, and across rocky hillsides. Jack's body began to ache from the constant movement, his muscles protesting with each step. But he didn't stop. The Apache man kept a steady pace, never looking back, and Jack knew that he had to keep up. They rode for hours, stopping only briefly to drink from streams or to rest in shaded areas. The sun was high in the sky by the time they reached the base of the mountains. The rocky path ahead seemed steep, almost insurmountable, but the Apache man didn't hesitate. "The mountain will show you the way," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper against the wind. Jack took a deep breath, gathering his strength. He knew that this was the moment. This was where his training would truly begin. The path was treacherous, the rocks loose underfoot, and Jack had to focus every ounce of his energy just to keep his footing. Sweat poured down his face as he climbed, his lungs burning with every breath. The Apache man moved ahead with ease, his body familiar with the terrain, while Jack struggled to keep up. But he didn't give up. He pushed himself forward, his determination outweighing the physical pain. Hours passed, and the mountain grew steeper. The path narrowed, and Jack could see nothing ahead but the rising rocks and the sharp cliff edges. But as he crested the final ridge, he was met with a sight that took his breath away. The world stretched out before him, a vast expanse of land, the valley far below dotted with trees and streams. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the wind was cool against his sweat-soaked skin. The Apache man stopped and turned to face him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You have made it," he said. "The mountain has accepted you." Jack stood there for a moment, taking in the view, the sense of accomplishment rising within him. He had done it. He had passed the test. This is your first lesson, the Apache man said, his voice calm. Strength is not just physical. It is the strength to persevere, to overcome the obstacles that stand in your way. Jack nodded, the words sinking in. He had learned something deeper than he expected. This wasn't just about surviving the mountain. It was about understanding the will to continue, even when the path seemed impossible. They sat together on the rocky peak, the wind blowing softly around them, and the Apache man shared stories of his people's ancestors, tales of survival, courage, and the deep connection they had with the land. Jack listened, feeling the weight of their wisdom. The journey had only just begun. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack realized that his life had changed forever. The mountain had shown him what it meant to be strong, not just in body, but in spirit. The path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The Apache man looked at him one last time, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You are ready, he said simply. Jack smiled, feeling the weight of his new purpose settling over him like a cloak. He was no longer just a cowboy, he was becoming something more, something that had been written in the stars long before he had ever set foot on this land. The following morning, Jack awoke early, the cool air of the mountains settling into his bones. The sun had not yet risen, and the world was still wrapped in the quiet of the night. He stood and stretched, the movement a familiar routine now, even though his body had grown used to the demands of the Apache way. The days of isolation on his ranch, where he lived alone with his thoughts, felt like they belonged to another life. His life here, among the Apache, was different, challenging, rewarding, and filled with a deep sense of purpose he had never known before. He made his way outside, the stillness of the morning heavy with possibility. The landscape around him had become more familiar with each passing day. The towering peaks, the sweeping valleys, and the dense forests, everything felt like it had been waiting for him, just as the Apache man had said. The mountain has accepted you. The words echoed in his mind. Jack was beginning to understand what that meant. As he stepped outside, the Apache man who had been his guide appeared by his side, his presence quiet but commanding. Today, you will go with the hunters, the man said. It is time for you to learn how to move through the land as we do. Jack nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He had grown comfortable with the Apache's teachings, but this felt different. Hunting was a skill he had never truly mastered. He had always relied on the ranch for his food, his cattle providing what he needed. But here in this world, hunting was not just a means of survival, it was an art, a connection to the land. The group of hunters gathered, their faces calm and focused, each man carrying the tools of his trade with the same precision Jack had come to expect from the Apache. They were silent, their movements deliberate, as they prepared to leave. Jack joined them, his heart beating faster as they moved toward the dense forest. The forest was alive with the sound of the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. The hunters moved with grace, their bodies attuned to the rhythms of the land. Jack tried to match their pace, but it was clear he was still an outsider. His steps were heavy, his body not yet in tune with the land in the same way theirs were. But he didn't stop. He focused on the rhythm of their movement, his eyes scanning the surroundings as the hunters did. Hours passed as they moved deeper into the forest. Jack was starting to feel the weight of his new life, the constant challenge to learn, to adapt, and to prove himself. The air grew colder as they reached the edge of a clearing, where the hunters paused. In the distance, Jack spotted a group of deer grazing quietly. His heart raced. This was the moment. Now you will learn the patience of the hunt, the Apache man said quietly, his eyes fixed on the deer. You must be still. You must wait. Jack crouched down beside him, his body tense with anticipation. The deer moved slowly, unaware of the presence of the hunters. Jack's mind raced. He had hunted before, but this was different. The pressure to be precise, to move as one with the land, was immense. He felt the Apache man's gaze on him, steady, expectant. Time seemed to stretch on as Jack waited, his breath steadying as the deer came closer. It was a test of focus, of being present in the moment. He had to forget everything he knew about hunting. This was not about speed or strength, it was about stillness, about blending into the world around him. The deer was within range. Now, its movements slow and deliberate. Jack's hand hovered over his bow, his fingers itching to release the arrow. "Wait!" the Apache man whispered. The moment seemed to last an eternity, but Jack held his ground. And then, with a swift motion, he released the arrow. The shot was perfect. The deer fell gracefully to the ground, its body still. The hunters around Jack nodded, their faces unreadable but respectful. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had passed the test. He had proven that he was more than just a man with a gun and a horse. He was beginning to understand the way of the Apache, the connection to the land that ran deeper than anything he had ever known. As they moved toward the deer, Jack felt the weight of his new life settle around him. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer the man he had been. He was becoming something else, something more, and the Apache people were now part of his story.